Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Maria. And yeah, I suppose I'll just get right into it. My research generally kind of um, is between these kind of four areas of physiology, movement, behavior, and microclimate. And these fields or areas of research have kind of been maybe a bit siloed over the decades, but while that's kind of happened, they developed these really great methods. Um, but I think it's like about time that we start kind of bringing all these things together. And that's where I kind of locate my research, just kind of in the middle of all these four fields. And so my background is I was based in Australia for my PhD and postdoc at the University of, did my PhD years for University of Tasmania and then University of Melbourne postdoc. And now I'm in EFI, which is a research institute for wildlife ecology in Vienna. It's part of the Veterinary University. And yeah, so I'll be talking about the research I've done in the past that was in Australia, and now since I've been back in Europe, some of the stuff I'm getting into at the moment. So the kind of way I wanted to do this talk was just an overview of biophysical models, an introduction for everyone who doesn't know what they are, how they work, what they can potentially do, what kind of research can we do with them, and why I think that they're good for forecasting in general as we move forward with under climate change, but also other global change um, issues. And then I'll kind of show you some examples from my own work. So some work I've done on Australian species and how I've used those to address a number of topics, looking at the interaction between climate and habitat requirements, climate and life history strategies, and how they can also be used for hypothesis testing. So testing different hypotheses you might have, in this case about a past decline. And then I'll go into some of my current work, which is on hares in Austria, and I'll kind of focus there on how I'm trying to start thinking about integrating biophysical models with movement and behavior, and how this could allow us to discover some strategies that could lessen the effects of climate change going forward. And so the key idea behind biophysical models is an animal's environment affects its physiology and therefore it affects its behavior, which then has knock-on effects for how it can find food or a mate, etc. And so if you look just above the center in this photo, you'll see a koala lying on the base of that branch. And this may look similar to all the other parts of the environment, but it's actually chosen the coolest part of that tree trunk to lie on. And now we can simply kind of ask ourselves, what are the physiological and behavioral impacts if it didn't have access to this tree? If this tree wasn't there, what happens? And so biophysical models are essentially just a set of equations that capture balances of heat and water, mass exchange between an organism and their environment. And the really powerful bit is that they can quantify this interaction in what's people sometimes call the currencies of life. So energy and water, things that have are fundamental to all living beings, but how they have knock-on effects for um, uh, key things such as survival, reproduction, and whatnot. And these were developed originally by Warren Porter and David M. Gates in the US in the 60s, and they've really kind of been taken on by Mike Carney in the 2000s, 2010s onwards. And this is who I learned them off. Mike was involved in my PhD and in my postdoc, and he's been integral in creating the OR package for this for these models. So it's niche mapper. It's a really good tool. It's very well documented, but it's maybe a little bit underused. So I'd recommend people to check that out. But let's kind of go through what basic explanation. So take this dog, and this dog has various traits. It's got um, a certain body size, it's got a certain basal metabolism, it's got a certain shape, its fur properties are very maybe particular to that species, or in this case, maybe breed of dog. You can imagine a poodle would have different fur depths, of different fur lengths, a different size, whatever. And then you can say its environment also has different parameters. So the environment has a certain air temperature, a certain wind speed, certain amount of solar radiation, etc. So in this simple kind of example, we can think of maybe a metabolic chamber. And then what we want to do is then quantify the interaction with thermodynamic equations for the process of the metabolism. So the output we'll get from this interaction is the metabolic rate and the respiration. And then you could kind of imagine that we can then, this is the metabolic chamber. With our simulation, we then compare that against real metabolic chamber data to see that we're not just in the world of numbers, that we're actually tied to reality. And therefore we can see whether the thermal neutral zone that we predict is the same as one that we see in real experiments. And then we all know that the environment is a bit more complicated than metabolic chamber, but it can also be described from first principles. So you can take relatively available macro climate data and downscale it to microclimate data, again using these equations that were either developed due to thermodynamics or engineering. These are quite well described, and these have all been put together in, for instance, this niche mapper package. And so if we can put this animal in the microclimate, so then we can see what the animal's energy and water requirements are in this environment. But the key aspect of these biophysical models is that we can compare energy and water requirements of the animal here as to when it's over here at the same time. But then we can also compare these two to say if it was in a burrow at some point. And then we can compare this to the future and to the past. And this kind of is the reason why these are really good for forecasting, is that we can compare different scenarios to each other. And so this is really key paper, and these models kind of focus on this physiology aspect of these for better predictions. So we're trying to include more mechanism and trying to in order to better predict animals' responses to climate change. And you can see how, again, this would fit into the ecological forecasting initiative, because it not only helps you forecasting, but it might help you understand, manage, and conserve some of these species. But just so I'm a bit clear on this mechanistic, statistical kind of maybe divide, to be a bit clear about it, hope this isn't too simple for people, but I'll just kind of briefly describe why mechanistic models may be more advantageous than statistical models when looking at the effect of something like, say, climate change. And it's primarily down to the problem of extrapolation. So we have the simplified example, and we say we have a relationship between an animal's fitness and temperature. And if this all looks pretty straightforward, this is something we all do all the time. And then we say climate change is here, and we then have to predict into temperatures that the animal has never experienced. And we might predict something like this. So we're extrapolating these extreme fitness values that are outside the realms of potentially possibility. But let's be a bit fairer and say that this person has used some non-linear analysis, and they predict the organism to respond like this. But they could also just the organism could actually be responding like this, or like this, or like this. It's kind of impossible to confidently predict because we don't have the requisite data at this temperature range. Well, mechanistic models are relying on processes that, if are well described, like thermodynamical systems, the thermodynamics on Earth are the same as they are on Mars, the same they are in the future, is the same they are in the past. So they should hold in novel conditions. And the advantage of these models is kind of discussed at a bit of length in a paper by Natalie Briscoe and myself and some colleagues. So if you want to look at that, I'd recommend having a look. And just so I'm not saying that statistical models are not useful, but I'm just saying for some studies, such as those with physiology and behavior, we may not be accounting for the processes that limit or exacerbate climate change, while mechanistic models kind of explicitly do. And so for my first example, I'll describe how these models can better help us understand and quantify their interaction between climate and essential habitat requirements. And this example has no forecasting in it, but we can get to that later. So this is from a paper. I have a special issue of thermal biology, and we're looking at the thermal energetics of burrows, wombats and burrows. And so wombats are actually the second largest burrowing mammal, and the largest burrowing herbivore. And so there's 3 species. They are across most major habitat types in Australia. The northern hairy-nosed wombats in the blue, found in subtropical, tropical areas. They are one of the most endangered mammals in the world. The southern hairy nose is in the semi-arid and arid areas of Australia in the yellow, and then the green is the bare-nosed wombat, is the most common wombat, and that is found in temperate and alpine regions. So, as these animals have a lot of overlap in their physiology, they are quite similar to one another, but they do differ. They kind of blend into each other at some at different ends of the spectrum. So the southern hairy nose and northern hairy nose are quite similar, some differences in size, but that may be just due to a smaller population. So I kind of treated them as one kind of taxa, I say, but I included a lot of variation in their physiological parameters. So I said, let's create 100 wombats. They can vary between these 3 different species kind of range of parameters. And let's have a look at whether we can fit it to some metabolic chamber data. So we can see that the yellow points are the real data, and we can fit quite well this kind of the range of different values we expect are pretty close. And then we can bring this into a scenario where we're generating the microclimate of this tropical area in the summer and winter, and we can put this wombat, these simulated wombats, so these 100 wombats, and we can put them in a deep burrow. So I'm going from left to right. So deep burrow, a medium, shallow, in 100% shade, 100% surface, 100%, 0% shade in the surface. And we can just look at how much time they're allowed to be within their thermal neutral zones in these different areas. So you can see that in this tropical locations, burrows allow wombats to spend much more time in their thermal neutral zone, particularly in the winter. And then we can look at all the different sites, and you can see that the benefit of burrows varies between site and season, with burrows being more beneficial in summer in the arid and semi-arid areas in yellow, while they only allow slightly more time in the thermal neutral zone in the temperate zones in green. And here we can have the effect of the burrows on the energy and water requirements at 6 sites again. You can see that burrows provide a lot of energy and water savings, but that these savings again differ by site and by season. And so we take these black lines, we can see, so the black lines are the energy, and we can see that a shallower burrow is more advantageous in the summer, which is the solid line, while a deeper burrow is more advantageous, so it has less energy than in winter, which is the dashed line. So, and then when we look at the blue lines, which are the water requirements, we see that the burrows may be more important in the conservation of water and energy in the tropical areas at the top. And here we see kind of the real value maybe of burrows. So without them, we predict model failure in some cases. So model failure is when given our characterization of the model of the animal and its microclimate, we could find no solution. So it means it's a thermodynamic possibility given what we've said the animal needs to maintain its temperature at, what its size is, what its fur is, that it could not be able to maintain its core body temperature within this certain narrow bounds we've set for it, given the parameters. And we attempted to call this death in the paper, but a stern reviewer would not allow it. So let's just say it's complete incapacitation or a Garfield moment. It's just too hot to move. Like it just is completely incapacitated. And we can see that we predicted quite a number of these moments with no shade, so at the top, and quite a few less with shade. But we haven't seen any increase in them through time from 1980 to 2020, so no apparent effect of climate change on these. And however, we did have our first instance of a Garfield moment in a shallow burrow in 2020, and this could potentially be the beginning of something, that maybe shallow burrows don't provide the protection that maybe they did in the past. So this is something I want to kind of maybe delve further into in the future. And of course, there's medium and deep burrows aren't shown because they protected them from this extreme heat stress. And now if we go into example 2, which does involve forecasting. So we'll look at the interaction between climate and a key life history strategy. And so that key life history strategy is hibernation. And to do this, we had to develop a heterotherm biophysical models. We had to let the temperature be able to fluctuate more. It was much more complicated than I originally thought it was going to be. But then we used this to look at whether hibernators could potentially lose their competitive edge over non-hibernators with climate change. And so we did this, we looked at the mountain pygmy possum. It's also called Burramus, and it is Australia's only exclusively alpine marsupial, and it's thought to be the only Australian marsupial that undergoes true hibernation and not just torpor, so going in dropping its body temperature metabolic rate from time to time, or under a 24-hour period. It does this for a longer seasonal period. And so this species, again, critically endangered, and it's threatened by potentially further snow loss in the future and potential food mismatches. And so we had to develop, like I said, we had to develop this hibernation model, and then we had to test it. So reviewers weren't happy that we were just testing on one species, so we tested on 4 species. So across the size range, in the blue line is this prediction of the metabolic rate. The red line is the normal model that we've done, that's been well tested before, and then we compare this to the observed data from the literature, and we've got the hoary bat, we've got the mountain pygmy possum, the alpine marmot, the black bear, so from 30 grams to 66 kilos, pretty much across the range of mammal sizes, and we show that this model is predicting the metabolic rate of hibernating animals. And then in order to get this to work, it's quite complicated, this schematic of trying to make of when to allow the animal to be the model to be the standard model, and when for it to be the Topper model. And this you have to set up some rules. So you can say that, oh, the animal is active, so it's using the near surface when it's nighttime because it's nocturnal, and then it's inactive in the burrow at the daytime. And then you've got other rules that allow it to hibernate. So we selected this rule because of if it was below 8 degrees for more than 24 hours. And that was due to the fact that when in the lab, people haven't seen it hibernate under temperature values of 8 degrees. So it's not perfect. These are rules that are not arbitrary. We've justified them, but they're not perfect. Yeah. So the main thing is with this kind of setup, we can then compare. As I said, the real power is we can compare an animal hibernating and an animal that's not able to hibernate in the same area at the same time. But first we have to compare it to what we see. So at the beginning, at the top, we have the actual observed pattern of hibernation of the mountain pygmy possum. So it generally starts hibernating between October and November. Sorry, it starts hibernating between May, because you have to remember this is Australia. So April, May, and then it goes until October, November. And we can see that our observed pattern of hibernation matches up with this well enough with these with our simulated species going in at in April and then coming out in November, or going in May and coming out in October. And so it does match the real life pattern. And then we look at climate change and we see this decrease. So for instance, in Bogong, in the first one, we see this decrease in 3 weeks of hibernation. And then we can see for for Kosciuszko, we've got 27-day decrease. And then if we go 4 degrees of future climate change warming, we get a further decrease in the amount of hibernation these animals are able to do. And we can see that the non-linearities that are captured by these models and that are occurring, as you can see, it's 21. There's a 21-day decline at Bogong with 2 degrees, but with 4 degrees decline at 61 days. So yeah, these things are not linear. You don't just go 21 to 41 with 2 degrees and 4 degrees. There's potentially much drastic declines at higher temperatures. And then if we look at the energy usage across the months, sorry, the resolution isn't very high on this, but this is the 4 sites that these animals are found at again. And here we get with the 4-degree climate warming, we get this, especially in Bogong and Buller, we get this peak of energy that is higher than what they're experiencing now, and it's happening right before they'll need to hibernate. And the worry is that this could cause a potential mismatch with their food sources, because they're very reliant on a migratory moth species, and which have been in decline of late. So if you're getting your highest food requirements right before you need to go in, it might have more effects than what we're possibly able to uncover with these models of what the information we know about the species at the moment. And so for water levels, we don't see anything drastic. Seems like the main issue is in the middle of the year, so this hibernation period, that there's not this drastic increase in water requirements in the summer. And then, as I said, we can compare the energy usage for the animal over the year at the same site, with it being uh, able to hibernation. So hibernation is possible for it, or it's impossible. It cannot hibernate. It has to um, has to be active and inactive throughout the entire winter. And you can see that the advantage of hibernation declines with hibernation. So you um, the energy requirements for the possible and impossible um, hibernation species or hibernation animals starts to converge. Um, and so that is potentially quite a worry. And then we see that water requirements with climate change increase, but again, this difference decreases. So we start seeing that um, if the hibernators start to come more close together. And then if we look at this spatially, and we see that the energy required of that where hibernation is possible, this is impossible. So think of it as in this graph or this map, yellow means that being able to hibernate and not being able to hibernate is equivalent. There's no advantage of being able to hibernate. And so the warmer areas, which are the inland areas, there's no advantage of being able to hibernate. It never gets that cold. You don't really need to do it. While we see the four circles are the sites where they're located now, and we can see this shrinkage that occurs of hibernation being possible. So yeah, uh, and it kind of highlights that this island here is Tasmania, for those of you who don't know it, that it retains this advantage of hibernation with +4 degrees, large area of it. There's no mountain pygmy possums on the island, but it could be something that people may have to consider going forward. This is the kind of things that these models can kind of show us of that you also need to remember this isn't like a species distribution models. There's no information about where the animal is located. This is from its physiology with the microclimate of that area. That's it. It doesn't know like the model doesn't know where the animals actually are. Um, and so it's for this final example, I'll show you how biophysical models can be used for hypothesis testing. And so say we wanted to, well, we did want to know whether physiological stress caused a known decline. So this is more hindcasting, but you can imagine how you could, if you hypothesize a decline happening in the future, that you could test this as well. And so this we did this in the form of a paleo-ecological study. And so there's much debate in Australia about whether humans or climate change or the dingo were responsible for the extinction of the Tasmanian devil from mainland Australia about 3,000 years ago. And so we decided to see whether we could find any evidence of climate change causing stress for the devil. And so first, we had to define stress. So we had these different types of stress. We had plant stress, so it's in more kind of like an environmental stress. We had energy stress for the Tasmanian devil. So, and then we had water stress, and then we had these kind of different ways stress could have occur. So it could have high cumulative stress, it could have frequent stress, or it could have a high total amount of stress throughout the year. So there was different ways we could assess stress. And then we, in order to test when stress is high, we needed a baseline. And we used the thermal optimum, which is between 8,000 and it's about 6,000 years before present. And as this name suggests, it was a period of stable temperatures. But key, has also been shown that the genetic bottleneck that Tasmanian devils went through prior to the mainland extinction happened after this. So this is a period we, at least at the moment, are confident enough that there was a lot of large genetic diversity and a large population occurring. So then we could then compare stress to this period. So gray indicates that no stress occurred because, but then, yeah, so, and then the rest of the colors categories kind of express a percentage of the total stress and how much it exceeded that good period. So if the good period, if it's blue, that means it's the same as the good period. There's no difference. If it goes to light yellow, it starts getting worse, and then it can get quite a bit more. And so, say for instance, sorry, I'll go back to this plant one. We have kind of our plant stress index actually matches up with some pollen data that has been found to show that there's been a transition of the plant taxa to more drier and more dry tolerant taxa, and the areas where we've found stress has been shown that there actually was stress. So we've got some proof, maybe not the best. We're talking about thousands of years ago, but we can show that we are finding something that is actually happening. And then we kind of looked at this energy and water stress for the Tasmanian devil itself, and we can see that we do get some water stress happening quite a bit across these different areas, but especially for the cumulative water stress, these are areas where we have no strong evidence that there was devils there in high numbers. They were mainly towards the north and towards the south, not so much in the middle. And then we kind of did this for different combinations of all these stresses. So physiological stress was energy and water stress for all the stresses, including plant stress. And so we're trying to look at this in so many different ways. And then when we looked at the effect sizes, we saw nothing. Nothing was significantly different from the thermal optimum. So the thermal optimum we said is 8,000, 7,000, and then we looked at each 1,000-year period and we saw no difference. There's no difference in the stress that these devils or the plants or the different areas were experiencing across this whole period. So yeah, so we did see some evidence in the maps that there was a slight increase of stress, but it's ultimately not distinguishable from this good period. And so we can't entirely rule out climate change as being contributing to the extinction, as this increase could have been exacerbated by humans or by dingoes or whatever, but we can say that it alone wasn't the only reason. Yeah, and then I'll briefly just discuss what my current project is. So it's in Baden in Lower Austria. And so we've caught 32 grey partridges, 15 hares, and 4 beech martens. We've attempted to catch foxes, but we've had 0 luck. And also the martens, turns out we have little collars and they can just get out of collars. So every single one of them remove the collar pretty quickly. So at the moment, it's just partridges and hares are the focus. But for this end of the talk, I'll just be talking about hares. We have these loggers that are on them. You can see that little one on the partridge, little backpack. They've got GPS, accelerometers, temperature, and then we're trying to look at looking at how habitat structure affects different form, how habitat structure affects their ecology. And so currently the aims, as I said, I'll just focus on hares for this small little last bit of the talk. And the kind of aims are like, how well can we predict the microclimate that these animals are experiencing? How large an impact does habitat structure availability have on energy and water requirements in a temperate environment? Because a lot of what I've been talking about has been in Australia, and obviously even the temperate environments there can be quite a bit drier than in Europe. So And then I'll also be talking about will habitat structure become more important for behavioral thermoregulation in the future. And yeah, so there's a lot going on here, but this is here the 12 different hairs we have. The um, the red lines are, sorry, the red dots are the obs observed temperatures that we have from the loggers. The black dots as our prediction from our microclimate model, and the blue ones, the blue dots are what you'd predict with just the ambient temperature that you get from the ERA 5 data that's widely available for Europe. And we can kind of see that the ambient temperatures tend not that they don't tend to predict they don't tend to be hot enough. Is a lot of them are much colder than what we actually see the animals experiencing. So remember, the animal experiences the red. And so when we look at this for these different animals, our microclimate model has, for some of them, it doesn't go too well, but other ones it's good. So we end up the ambient temperature has a root mean squared error of almost 10. So it's usually about 10 degrees off, while our median roots mean squared error is about 3.5. There is some, I think we can get this much closer. These are just kind of some rough things I kind of did in preparation for this talk, but we still get a median R squared of about 0.7, which is pretty good considering there's not a whole lot of information I put into this. But this is something I'll improve. I hope to get it to about 2 or below. I don't think it'll be that difficult. And then we can generate some scenarios. So create this hair model. I'll run the microclimate model at our field locations for 0% shade, 50% shade, 100% shade. So 50% shade means that you still get some solar radiation coming through. You still get some wind, while 100% shade means that you're pretty isolated from the wind and that you're really not getting that incoming solar radiation. And so for this, I just did it for this study period. So from the 1st of July to the 31st of December, just to kind of show you on kind of a smaller scale, the first steps of how you build up these things. And then I comparing the energy demands at 0% shade, 50%, 100%, and then the same with the water, and then how these will change with a 2 and a 4 degree increase. So this is the daily energy requirements, and we can kind of see that shading in the summer does not really make much difference to the daily energy requirements, but shading allows for some savings. So 100% shading is the yellow, allows for some savings of energy in the winter. And then in the summer, then it's opposite for water. We have shading provides water savings in the summer, but it doesn't have that much of an effect in the colder months. And then when we look at climate change, we see that the period that shading doesn't really seem to make a difference. Climate change doesn't seem to make all that difference to the total energy requirements. It's obviously this is a very small period, but we're not seeing any climate change effects. But we are seeing some for the water usage. And we can see that the water usage goes up with climate warming, but it goes down for each one with the amount of shading. And the interesting thing about this graph is if you draw a line from here to here, you can see that you end up with the same water requirements at 0% shade today as you do with 50% shade at 2 degrees and 100% shade at 4 degrees. So this little figure can just show that habitat structure buffers the effect of climate change. That if shading is available to these animals, that the effects of climate change it can be mediated. But whether that is actually realistic for a hare, which is not going to be living in a place that's 100% shading, is another story, and that's something we'd obviously have to think about. But that's something I want to kind of add in, kind of more realism, longer time frames. I want to do the same for partridges, get some real behavior patterns. So we have the accelerometers. We're going to be looking at when they're moving, when they're not moving. The real structure data is how much structure is available to them and when they use it. Maybe you can start trying to develop some spatial maps of habitats, because both of these species are widely found in Europe, of habitat structure hotspots. So where would they need, at what times of year would they need a high amount of shading? You'd imagine in the south, imagine Spain, that you would need a lot of shading for if you're a partridge there, while you need that in the summer, while in the winter you might benefit more from shading in say Sweden in winter. And then I don't know how realistic it would be, but I would be interested in looking at how impactful is increased water needs in temperate environment. As we all know, temperate environments have quite a high water availability. So does this make a difference? Could water potentially be driving bigger changes in behavior, or is it just inconsequential? They just need to maybe come out a little bit earlier, get more of the early morning dew, and they're fine. So yeah. And that's pretty much it. I'd just like to say Gur Míle Mágaibh, which is thank you very much in Irish, or people might know it as Gaelic. And yeah, I've got a link to my Google Scholar, or if you want to email me about anything I've talked about, just feel free. If you have any questions or would like some resources, I'm happy to help.
Great, thank you very much, Shane. That was a super interesting talk. And we can open the floor now to questions. Yeah, feel free to raise your hand. It's probably the easiest way to get my attention, or post in the chat. But while people have a think about it, I can kick off with some questions, because yeah, I was really inspired by that talk. And the first one that I have relates to you mentioned sort of downscaling broad scale climate data into this microclimate data that seems so important for these biophysical models. And I just wondered if you could talk. I mean, that sounds like a really cool thing to be able to do, downscale and get really local levels of climate data. Is that quite easy to do? What sort of data do you need in terms of the sort of area that you're trying to downscale to in order to do that?
Yeah, so there's loads of different OR packages that are available that do it for you. So you're not creating the equations yourself or anything. So like I said, if you go to Niche Mapper, there's a microclimate model. It can draw on different, it uses macroclimate data, so temperature data, solar radiation data at a large scale, and then it does all the algorithms itself. There's another one called microclima, which is also it requires a bit more information about the environment. So you can say what your soil type is, what kind of vegetation is in the area, and it will compute it for you. So they're more straightforward than you think. I think the key is that they have been well tested, but I think for something like you need to have microclimate data yourself to maybe compare it against, unless you can be pretty confident. It depends on what the animal is. If it's the thing, these microclimate models are maybe a bit easier for bigger animals, because they're kind of maybe they can't just find shade everywhere. While something like, you imagine a small lizard or whatever, it's anything is shade for it. like a flower, someone has a flower pot, there's a big flower in it, it's shade for it, while for a cow, that's not going to work. So yeah, it really kind of depends on your species about how good you can get the microclimate, and also but how much it matters to it. Yeah, it really depends on your question, but they're much easier. Microclima, the microclimate model in Niche Mapper, check them out. You'll be surprised by you'll find something more useful, or even just better resolution than what you're maybe currently using.
Cool. Thank you very much. I think Cara has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. That was super interesting. I was curious what you think in the context of forecasting for these biophysical models. Like, what kind of data do you think they would be best at that they could predict and that we can compare to real data? Is it things like distributions or activity patterns? Like, where do you see, like, what kind of outputs do you think would be best used in a forecasting setting?
Ooh, it's really dependent on the question, because the the thing that I find, I suppose, the most difficult is to know whether an increase in energy or a decrease in energy, or an increase in water or decrease in water, actually means anything. You know what I mean? Like, you suddenly need more energy. If there's plenty of Mars bars around, it doesn't matter. While if there's none, it's a problem. So, and I think a lot of these things are climate changes, that you might get these increases in something like energy or water, but there's also maybe more stuff around. So it's kind of, that's the hardest thing, is to translate, to tie um the currencies to something. Like, people have tried to do it before, where they've tried to tie it to, say, the amount of milk that the female could produce. And so if that is limited, that is going to have real knock-on effects. While if it's so stuff like that, I think is probably, the thing is that needs to be researched for some really well-known animals. That kind of stuff is known as how much energy is needed to produce the milk, and so I think stuff like that would be. It sounds really strange, but it actually would have a real life impact, I think, than say something like just energy or water. I don't know. Did that
Yeah,
maybe help?
yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Maria.
Yes, let me try to ask my question. Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you very much, Shane. Hi again. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it too. And from my side, and maybe you touched a little bit on it with your response to Kara, but I think maybe more philosophically, I agree that mechanistic models are super important for forecasting, but still they're not very often used. So we don't really even know, like how well do they perform compared to other approaches and whatnot. What do you think is the biggest challenge of using these models in forecasting? Right? Why do you think we're still so limited in their usage?
They're really they're complicated. Like, I was initially using species distribution models for my PhD, and I read a couple of papers by Mike Carney, who I mentioned, and I had, over the course of maybe a month or 2 months, I'd got my head around species distribution models, and then I tried to do this, and it took me 4 years or something to really to learn it. So they're complicated. So I think that's the main barrier. They don't have to be as complicated. I think they could. They've they've there's been attempts to make them more modular, but I think there's many ways to use them wrong. And I think at the beginning, that's what I thought. Like, if I spotted any difference in anything, that was important. But I think just the whole pipeline from the first setting yourself up with learning a different approach, that it's not statistics, that this is just a completely, completely different way of looking at a problem. So I think the barrier to entry is time. I think if I was someone who was a professor now and I was interested in these things, I think I would have encourage a PhD student to do it, and then I could absorb it through them, because I was lucky and I did it in my PhD, but you really need a lot of time. I think that might be the main, unfortunately, maybe the main barrier. That's not to
Yeah.
say that like people you can't learn them. I'm sure it is. I just am not a very physics person before a maths person, so trying to learn these things that are very physics heavy, maths heavy, maybe for someone else, especially people who might have done a bit of physics in the past, I think it'll be much easier for someone like them. But not all of these mechanistic models are based in physics. I mean, a lot of them are, but I mean, that would what I would think would be the major barrier.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Shane? Yep, it's them.
Hi, thank you for this nice talk. And my question is probably a bit too tangential, and it's more of a curiosity kind of question, but I'm wondering if there are any groups out there that are incorporating somehow like the evolutionary layer, like coupling these to the biophysical models. Is the adaptation of these species like too slow, too inconsequential with respect to climate change? Or can it be another realism, so to speak, to these models?
Yeah, I mean, I know my colleague Mike has tried, but again, I suppose it's difficult. Like you could build in um, evolutionary change through time if you wanted. You could say that the animal gets bigger or smaller, or loses hair or changes its color, through time. You could program these things in, but um, yeah, you could do it, but I don't know of anyone who's explicitly trying to do it, because there's there's so many parameters in these things, and trying to pick parameters for um, things that are uh, alive right now and what seems sensible is difficult enough. To start trying to theorize what's within the realms of possibility in the future. Maybe for something like hair color, which could potentially change in a much rapider, more rapid scale than something like maybe body mass. Maybe that would be of interest. But yeah, it's definitely possible.
Thank you. That was a cool question and a cool answer. Thank you. That was super interesting. I'd also been wondering about evolution. There's also a question in the chat from Pat Demandon. So she said, really cool talk, Shane. Just curious, what are your expectations on the water requirements of the hares when subjected to combined habitat and biotic changes? Can we expect shading to be more or less important when the presence of competitors or predators are taken into account?
Yeah, so that's the big I think the big what's the word, blind spot for these models is that they have no predator prey reaction interactions. I mean, you could potentially try and program them in, like say that, oh, they need to forage at these times, but they can't go at these times because that's when the foxes come out or whatever it is. So yeah, I do. It's hard to say because you need to have so much information about the other animal as well. That was initially something I wanted to look at with the foxes and the martens, but they at the moment do not like collars in any way, shape, or form. So I wanted to try and get my handle on the predation as well, but that's not looking like that's going to happen. But the water requirements for the hares, it's hard to say. I don't, Yeah, I can't imagine it being, yeah, it's really like you would have to have a handle on how much they're actually intaking. And I haven't really looked into that yet. So I think at the moment, I mean, yeah, I don't, unless people started, I mean, these kind of things, maybe in a temperate environment, aren't very important, but the kind of the water requirements, I think, are something maybe we haven't really thought about before. Because a really maybe extreme example, but an interesting example comes from work that Mike Carney did, and he was looking at the night parrot, which is um, a parrot species, very, very rare bird species in Central Australia. It's a ground parrot, so it's not like but it lives in very arid areas. And they were looking at this biophysical model of the parrot species, and then they compared it to tracking locations of the parrot, and they went on bottom of our model. It looks like it shouldn't be able to come out at this point. It shouldn't exist in this area. It's too dry. Its water demands are too high. We've obviously missed something. And when they went to the spot in the middle of like desert Australia, they found a trough of water that was for cows. So it wouldn't have been able to be there if it wasn't for the trough. But um, I don't know whether that kind of thing is going to happen in Austria where it rains quite a bit. But you can see where um, there was an incongruency that they saw in the model, and when they went out to actually look at it, it explained it. So that's kind of where the power, to me, was really conveyed of these models, is that it's that they're not just disconnected from the world, but if they're done well and in conversation, that they can be, that's where the power comes from.
Great, thank you very much, Shane. So it's just past the hour, so I guess we will let you off the hook. Thank you very much again for that super interesting talk.